Welcome to a special broadcast. India at G7 Summit. Canada is hosting a 3-day G7 Summit that is concluding today in Kananaskis resort area of Alberta province. Leaders of 7 advanced economies, which are also Western democracies, have congregated there. But US President Donald Trump left the venue a short while back.
But before Trump left Canada, the G7 put out a statement calling for de-escalation of hostilities in West Asia. We'll tell you more about but before that, let's tell you, though India is not a G7 member state, every year it is invited to the summit, and PM Modi will be addressing the outreach session of the G7 summit for the 6th time.
Yes, Ramesh, India has been raising the voice of the global south at the summit. This year, PM Modi is expected to speak on crucial global issues like energy security, technology and innovation, particularly the AI, that is artificial intelligence, energy mixes and quantum-related issues.
And PM Modi is expected to also put the spotlight on the issue of cross-border terrorism, especially since this is his first participation in a multilateral summit after Operation Sindoor.
Yes, our correspondent will be joining us from Canada for live updates on the G7 summit, and experts and former ambassadors will also join us to put the G7 summit and India's participation in it in perspective. I'm Anand Bhattacharya, and with me is my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran.
Welcome. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi arrived in Canada this morning to attend the G7 summit at Kananaskis, with discussions for world leaders to be focused on crucial global issues, including energy security, technology and innovation.
Upon his arrival, PM Modi in a post on social media said, and I quote, landed in Calgary, Canada to take part in the G7 summit. We'll be meeting various leaders at the summit and sharing my thoughts on important global issues. We'll also be emphasizing the priorities of the global south.
So PM Modi is visiting Canada at the invitation of Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney after successfully concluding his 2-day visit to Cyprus. Now, this is Prime Minister Modi's first visit to Canada in a decade. He's on a 4-day, 3-nation visit of Cyprus, Canada and Croatia.
DD India correspondent Amritpal Singh reports from Canada's Alberta.
As the gathering of the leaders of arguably the most powerful 7 nations of the world, the Western powers, began here in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta, war continues to dominate the agenda of the G7. And it's not the Russia-Ukraine war alone, given the fact that President Zelensky has been invited to attend this time around. It is the latest Israel-Iran conflict that continues to dominate the agenda here in Canada.
While Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney wants to push his agenda for strengthening global peace and security, building critical mineral supply chains and creating jobs, issues such as US tariffs and the conflicts in West Asia and Ukraine continue to dominate the summit.
Der Fortschritt des Irans.
This issue, Iran-Israel conflict, will be very high on the agenda of the G7 summit.
Am Freitag militärische Ziele.
And this is an issue on which there are divisions within the grouping on how the conflict could be brought to an end. All that the G7 leaders could agree upon is to issue a joint statement calling for de-escalation. Canada has already ditched the idea of a comprehensive joint communique and is expected to issue chair summaries instead. Apart from the G7 countries, leaders from India, Ukraine, Mexico, Australia, South Africa, South Korea and Brazil will be attending the outreach session on June 17th. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Canada, marking the second leg of his 3-nation tour after Cyprus. He will exchange views with leaders of G7 countries, other invited outreach countries, and heads of international organizations at the summit on crucial global issues, including energy security, technology and innovation, particularly the AI energy nexus and quantum related issues.
This is the sixth consecutive time that India has been invited as a G7 guest country, which speaks for itself about India's importance in the world. There will be discussions on the sidelines within the G7, or also on the sidelines with all the invitee countries, with the G7 countries, especially on topics of energy security, innovation, emerging technologies, quantum, AI, things which affect all of us today.
The Prime Minister will also hold several bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the summit.
Apart from India's participation in the outreach session of the G7, Prime Minister Modi's bilateral engagements with world leaders would be significant, especially the one with Mark Carney, which could well prove to be an opportunity to reset the ties between the two nations. With cameraman N.A. Sivakumar, this is Amrit Pal Singh for DD India in Alberta, Canada.
Now, members of the Indian diaspora across the North American nation of Canada have extended a warm welcome to Prime Minister Modi and expressed hope for a renewed chapter in India-Canada relations.
As Prime Minister Narendra Modi arrives here in Canada, there is visible excitement in the Indian diaspora. Also, there is optimism about the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Carney, given that the relationship between India and Canada in the past couple of years wasn't at its best. The diaspora says they are pinning hopes on that meeting between Carney and Modi to see an upswing in the relationship. I have with me Harish Consul. He's a prominent member of the Indian diaspora here. He's CEO of Okro Group. Hi Harish, thank you for speaking to us. How do you see this meeting, and how do you see what kind of opportunity do you see in the relationship going on an upswing?
We're very excited about Prime Minister Modi's arrival. You know, it's been some recent sensitive news, but there's never been a better opportunity for us to remend, grow together. India is the fourth largest economy now, fastest growing. Alberta in particular is the fastest growing region in North America. There's so many opportunities together in tech and innovation and energy and security and ag tech. So we're very excited. The entire community, bahut khush hai.
Canada is looking for a partner, especially I can speak for Alberta, because the Premier of Alberta has opened up a Alberta-India trade corridor, which is going to talk about business. Right now we do $188 billion of business with the United States and just around about $500 million with India. So we want to triple our business with India.
This invitation has opened a big room for both the countries to work together, prosper together, and definitely it will improve the bilateral ties. Yeah. So I agree that it is going to make a big difference.
We both are one of the largest democracies in the world. India is going to be a $10 trillion economy. Canada is already an advanced economy. There is a lot of scope for our cooperation in the green energy, in the IT sector, in the quantum mechanics, in the space exploration. Opportunities are innumerable.
So I'm very much hopeful that this time ties between India and Canada is going to be more stronger. Our bilateral relationship is going to be more stronger, and we're going to be having a lot of business within these two countries. Because if you see in last 10 years, a lot of Indian people they are flying to Canada, they are migrating here, and it is very important to have the better relationship between these two countries.
So this is the sentiment in Canada on the eve of that crucial meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Carney. The expectation is that this crucial meeting could well prove to be the beginning of a reset in Indo-Canadian ties. With cameraman N.A. Sivakumar, this is Amrit Pal Singh for DD India in Alberta, Canada.
And And now we are being joined by our guest, Ambassador J.S. Mukul. He's former Ambassador of India to the Netherlands. He's also served as Ambassador of India to Oman and Consul General of India in Munich, Germany. And Professor Harshvardhan Pant, the Vice President ORF, is also joining us. Such a pleasure to have the two gentlemen here on DD India, the special broadcast. Ambassador, I'll begin with you. What's your assessment with how things have been in the past 2 to 3 days in Canada at the G7 summit? Questions have always been raised, particularly since Trump 1.0 on the relevance of the G7. We remember that photograph, don't we, when former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and some other European leaders were trying to tell Trump to do certain things in a certain way, but he was defiant. So there have been questions since Trump 1.0 on the relevance of the G7 summit. How do you think the summit has turned out this time around?
Well, good evening. No, first of all, let us be clear that with Mr. Trump around, there is no dearth of drama. As you pointed out, that in Trump 1.0 in 2018, he had left the G7 summit, which also happened, incidentally, to be in Canada in a bit of a huff. Not happy with the way the communique was being crafted, and had refused to join the communique. Now this time, of course, he has left for entirely different reasons. He has left earlier, but as you said, in the last 2-3 days, this G7 summit has actually been completely overshadowed by the Israel-Iran conflict. Now, we were aware that there are a lot of geostrategic turbulence going on even before this conflict started in terms of Ukraine and Russia. That is why President Zelensky of Ukraine is there. Also, the Israel-Gaza issue in West Asia. But what came as a surprise, and I think the timing has been such that this summit, in my view, has been completely overshadowed. And as I think we will also see in the final conclusion, the focus has been on the Israel-Iran conflict and war. And obviously, hope is that some kind of a call would go out which would lead to some kind of a de-escalation, because this seems to be getting out of hand. And we are still not sure as to what the protagonists, particularly the United States, because the statements coming from Mr. Trump have been kind of contradictory. Has he gone to take some? He said he has gone for something greater. Now, what does it entail? Is it going to be de-escalating? Is it going to be a further escalation? So I think those are all the shadows which are falling on this G7 summit. But be that as it may, the G7 remains an important forum. As you had described it, it is the forum of the most powerful democracies, the Western democracies, and important economic entities, albeit that their economic salience and their influence in the world has been falling. This has actually been falling not just now, but over the last 2-3 decades. Since 1970. If I can take a minute to just take you through this, since 1975, when they were actually calling the shots and setting the global agenda, as it were, then suddenly in the late 90s, they realized that that was not enough. So they had started with the G20. In fact, it was the G7 which had created the G20 by bringing in the leading economic emerging and developing countries of the world to address the East Asian crisis at that time. But that was only at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors. Going further, in 2008, when the global international and financial crisis hit the world, it was the G7, particularly the US, led by the US at that time, which raised the G20 to the summit level. And for the first time, we had a platform on which the developed and the developing countries, the leading developing countries, could have a level, could sit on the high table, as it were. And rest, as they say, is history. In between, of course, there has been also the G7 had become G8, with Russia being involved from 1998 to 2014, when it was, of course, expelled. And I was reading statements of Mr. Trump just as he left the summit earlier today, or earlier today, I guess, in Indian time, when he said that
expulsion of Russia was a big mistake.
It was a big mistake, and then he even went on in response to a question that he would have no objection to China coming in. So I think these are, I don't know whether these are off-the-cuff remarks or there is some thinking behind this, but the fact of the matter is that the G7 has been declining, though it remains a very important forum, it has been declining, and it has acknowledged that by creating the G20, of which, of course, India and other leading emerging and developing market economies are important members. And that's where the North-South angle comes in. It has become a forum for North-South dialogue, particularly this outreach, where countries like India have been flagging the global South issues, particularly relating to development, etc. This was exactly what Prime Minister Modi had done at the last G7 summit in Italy, when he had placed importance on development and the global South. That was also after India's presidency of the G20. He had also, of course, focused on technology and energy transitions. So let us see. I don't know whether the PM's speech at this summit is awaited. I haven't seen it personally, but I very much believe that there will be a lot of these subjects going forward, when there will be continuity, when the Prime Minister will speak of technology, innovation, he will speak of energy transitions, and also development issues, particularly important to the global South.
Right.
In addition, there will be one other issue certainly which I believe the Prime Minister will flag strongly, and that is the issue of counter-terrorism, particularly as this happens to be his first visit after the Pahalgam attack.
Right. Professor Pant, good to have you as well join this special broadcast. Coming to you now, we've seen three big headlines coming out of the summit already. One, there's not going to be any joint communique this time, but there's a joint statement on the Iran situation. And last but not the least, as Ambassador Mukul was mentioning, Trump has already left the venue. Your thoughts on your expectations from this year's edition of the G7 summit, Professor Pant?
Ramesh, I think gradually we have seen expectations getting lowered from G20. We do not see, the ability of the ability of G7 to manage or to coordinate even amongst themselves when it comes to global governance and seemingly very, very potent issues on the table seems to be becoming more and more constrained. And I think the way Mr. Trump has in the past, I think Munmun was talking about the past experience of Trump 1.0. Now you see in this version, we are again witnessing him talking about Russia and China perhaps can be potential members of G7. So I think his commitment to this platform remains as limited as perhaps it was last time. He doesn't feel any need to have a coordinated response on a range of issues with the Western partners. We are talking about the decline of the West as an entity. So I think in that context, having a country like India and having other countries, other stakeholders present is a sign of maturity that G7 in and of itself, particularly in the age of Mr. Trump, is unable to justify its presence, and we are going to see that being reflected as we have seen it being reflected this time, where the biggest issue, which is the conflict raging between Iran and Israel, is being managed in a haphazard manner. The statement coming out of G7 is not particularly reassuring. It does not say that all the countries are on the same page. Mr. Trump has his own approach to this question. He has been making all kinds of statements about the conflict. He has just said that, look, I will not target Ayatollah Khamenei, but he's within reach, but I will not target him. So all kinds of statements are coming in. I think his main priority is to get some kind of a negotiated settlement out of this, which makes him look good. So clearly the larger issues, which I think many of the other countries in the G7 will be worried about, are not his priority, and therefore we are not going to see any great vision coming out of this summit. But where it becomes important is, of course, for India, the bilateral engagements that Mr. Modi would be having with a lot of other leaders, India putting up, I think in some ways, the vision of the global south, the aspirations of the global south on the table, and of course India-Canada relations, if this particular summit can become a fulcrum around which the future expectations of India-Canada relationship can be maneuvered, I think that would be a great, that would be a big achievement for I think the relationship itself, which had been in the doldrums for a while. So I think while by and large, we are going to see a G7 not as a particularly effective platform for the kinds of issues that it was designed to tackle anymore. I think bilateral engagements and India's presence there does lend it certain weight in Indian foreign policy engagements, and I think that's what we should be looking at from the G7.
Yes, we'll take that forward. Akshay Dongre, a correspondent, is joining us from the newsroom. He tracks foreign affairs very closely. Akshay, coming to you, we are looking at a lot of developments taking place. Trump left the summit venue after there was an agreement on a statement on Iran-Israel. Some would say that still the US and European countries are not on the same page on it. On Ukraine also, Mark Carney, the host of the G7 summit, has said the support for Ukraine will be unwavering on final day of the G7 summit, at a time when Donald Trump had left before Zelensky could arrive at the summit venue, and did say that he doesn't believe that sanctions on Russia are really helpful. So there are a lot of diverging statements, yet Mark Carney is attempting to put out a facade of consensus in a sense, and India, of course, will be pushing the voice of the global south. How do you look at the latest developments?
Well, it's quite an important event taking place at such a crucial point of time. We have seen several conflicts erupting in the last 2-3 years, but the situation at present is the gravest of them all. We are seeing potentially a war that was expected to take place for several decades, that had been growing up, and now finally it seems that things are in motion. And at that point, some of the most developed economies being gathering at the same place was a very crucial point in which they could have in fact discussed a way out of this entire mess that is going to impact the global economy. However, Prime Minister Narendra Modi being there also is going to be significant for the rest of the members as well, because given the geographical proximity, India is perhaps the only major economy, major country that neighbors this region, and that given that fact, India can play a crucial role, especially because it has great relations with both Israel and Iran. And if there is a country like we have seen in Ukraine conflict as well, that can speak to both the leaders like Prime Minister has been doing so far, then it's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. His presence there is going to be quite important for this entire conflict. Certainly Donald Trump, though he's saying or rather claiming that he is going to do much greater things, but one thing is very clear with the kind of movements that are taking place as far as this entire conflict is concerned. He has left early, so things are in motion, and it seems that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is being present at the venue of G7 is going to in a way help India as well negotiate through or rather navigate through all of this mess that is going to impact our energy supplies, that is going to impact our region, and quite honestly that is also going to impact our diplomatic relations with the countries there in the region, because certainly there will be expectation that countries should pick a side now as far as this conflict is concerned, and if there is a country that has great relations with both the countries and leaders, that's India, and the navigating of this entire diplomatic mess is going to be something that India may help them with, because otherwise what it seems as of now is that there are a lot of fissures between the opinions of the US and the rest of the countries in Europe, especially the closer allies of the US, as far as who to support in this entire conflict, while some major economies have already given statements of support for Israel, but there are many other European economies as well that have also voiced their opinion for a ceasefire or end of hostilities, or even for the two-state solution that has been the call for many countries. So the situation is complicated at this point in time. The next 48 hours are going to be very important, and with Prime Minister Narendra Modi being in Canada, it certainly is going to help these economies navigating their way out of this, because unless meddled with, unless stopped immediately, this conflict is going to spill over very soon. There is going to be a lot of collateral as far as human life is concerned, as well as the global economy that is going to impact everyone across the world.
Indeed, Akshay, do stay on. We are standing by for the first visuals of the Prime Minister Modi's arrival at the summit. When he will get you those visuals when they become available. But just to bring you some more updates from the G7 summit, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in Canada to urge the group of 7 nations to provide more backing for the war against Russia.
Zelensky also met Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who said Ottawa would provide $2 billion Canadian dollars in new military assistance for Kiev, as well as imposing a raft of new financial sanctions. At the end of the summit, Canadian Prime Minister Carney plans to issue a statement calling for more pressure on Russia through sanctions.
Canada is announcing today several measures, sanctions, first and foremost, against a number of individuals in Russia, against over 40 entities in Russia and beyond that are trying to contribute to the evasion of sanctions, the sanctioning of over 200 vessels in the shadow fleet that Russia is using, again, to try to evade these sanctions. That's the first thing. The second is we are providing additional military assistance, drones, helicopters, broader munitions, over $2 billion worth of assistance directly to Ukraine. And thirdly, we are dispersing the next tranche of the loan based on the frozen Russian assets, over $2 billion as well. This is our contribution. We'll be working with our European and other allies for their contributions to provide the support.
Need support from our allies, and I'm here, and thank you for the military package. It's important for our soldiers to be strong at the battlefield, to stay strong until Russia will be ready for the peace negotiations. We are ready for the peace negotiations, unconditional ceasefire. I think it's very important, but for this we need pressure. And of course I want to speak with Prime Minister today about sanctions, additional sanctions, and thanks for the real unwavering support from your side.
Meanwhile, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also arrived at the G7 meeting in Canada on Tuesday. High on the agenda of the meeting of the world's leading industrialized countries are the Israel-Iran hostilities and the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
As he met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Rutte praised Ottawa's vow to boost funding for the armed forces and hit NATO's 2% military spending target this financial year.
Thank you so much for this very warm welcome, and I'm really looking forward to the summit next week, but of course first today an important meeting this morning here in Canada, and in this G7 which you are chairing, I think, in an exemplary way. I really thank you for doing this and the leadership you provide. I also want to say that the fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic.
At G7, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hailed an intensive and good G7. She said the European Union is in intense and demanding negotiations for a trade agreement with the United States.
And earlier on Monday, G7 leaders called for de-escalation in West Asian conflicts, starting with the Israel-Iran hostilities, as US President Donald Trump hastily left the group's summit. Now, Trump, who was making his return to the international diplomatic calendar, departed the gathering in the Canadian Rockies a day early as ally Israel pounded Iran.
After a day of statements backing diplomacy, Trump ominously took to social media to sound a warning to people in the Iranian capital, whose population is nearly 10 million, having earlier hesitated at backing a joint statement on the crisis, Trump relented during a dinner at a forested lodge under the snow-capped mountains in Kananaskis. A joint statement released by Canada said that Israel has a right to defend itself and stressed the importance of the protection of civilians, as the growing attacks kill civilians on both sides.
Also, the group of 7 nations have expressed support for Israel and labeled its rival Iran as a source of instability in West Asia. In a statement issued late on Monday, the leaders called for peace and stability in the region.
The joint statement backed by Trump, released by Canada, urged that the resolution of the Iranian crisis leads to a broader de-escalation of hostilities in West Asia, including a ceasefire in Gaza.
The statement also said that Israel has a right to defend itself and stressed the importance of the protection of civilians as the growing attacks kill civilians on both sides. Now, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the US also said their conviction is that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon.
Like we've been saying, US President Donald Trump cut short his G7 summit visit earlier today, although he rejected claims that his early departure from the G7 summit was related to efforts towards a ceasefire between Israel and Iran.
Meanwhile, Trump rebuffed France's President Emmanuel Macron's claims that he left the G7 summit to work on a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Macron revealed that Trump had floated a ceasefire proposal between Israel and Iran, adding a dramatic twist to the summit's closing hours.
So Trump dismissed the assertion as incorrect, saying Macron had no understanding of the real reason for his return, which he hinted was related to something far more significant.
He added that whether purposely or not, Emmanuel always gets it wrong. Stay tuned, he said. Right, we still have with us our guests, Ambassador Mukul and Professor Pant. Ambassador Mukul, if I can come to you now. It's interesting, to read and to decode the composition of the G7 summit in terms of leaders attending or not attending this edition of the summit. We've seen the Canadian hosts invite 10 countries. 7 of them are in attendance, 3 are not. Those 3 countries are Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Indonesia. Now, should we see it as a design? Probably the 3 countries did not want to take part in a summit that criticized Iran, for instance. I mean, could that be one of the reasons?
Yeah, certainly I think that would be one of the reasons, because the G7 in terms of the Israel-Iran conflict was expected to be. I mean, all these 7 individually side with Israel, though to different degrees, one would say. So naturally, Saudi Arabia, UAE and Indonesia would find it a little awkward to associate. That could be one of the reasons, though we do not know exactly what were the full circumstances of their not participating. But what I would like to say here is that as the G7 is rolling out, I think questions before we go to the outreach countries that they have invited, I think a lot of questions will be raised about the credibility of the G7 in terms of their own unity. We know that there are a lot of transatlantic dissonance between United States and Europe, and I think even on the question of de-escalation on Iran-Israel war, they don't appear to be certainly on the same page. We know that they are not on the same page with regard to the Ukraine-Russia problem, as also the Israel-Gaza issue. So I think there is a lot. G7 needs to first get its act together in terms of trying to resolve its internal differences and contradictions, because obviously the United States is by far the most important member of the G7. Of course, the outreach countries come in. As you said, there are 7 in attendance, 3 have not come. But obviously, they are not part of the G7. I mean, we are not part of the G7. We are there in terms of the invitations. In fact, if I can go back before the G20 was raised to the summit level, from the late 90s, there used to be then it was the G8 with Russia included. There used to be a G8 plus 5 grouping, which was India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and Mexico, which was also known as the L'Aquila process. Now, this outreach has always been there, so that is nothing new. I mean, and it is the prerogative of the host, in this case, Prime Minister Carney of Canada, whom he wants to invite. So really, it is for the G7 in the first instance to get their act together. Of course, the outreach countries will do whatever they need to do and will try to contribute. We may have a chance to discuss, this will have far-reaching implications on the G20, because if the G7 cannot get its act together, it will be very difficult going forward for the G20. But that, I think, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that is for the future.
No, but we'll take that forward with Professor Pant. Professor, some are asking that why in the African continent only South Africa has been invited this time around, whereas there were many more countries that Italy had invited during the Apulia summit. So the idea of calling these countries from the global south is to ensure that G7 becomes a bridge in a sense between the West as well as countries from the global south or developing countries. How effectively is Canada as G7 chair playing that role? South Africa is of course the G20 chair, if I haven't said so far.
Yeah, I think, in some ways, it also reflects the nation who is hosting its priorities, foreign policy priorities. Italy has a lot of challenges when it comes to Africa, and I think Italy's foreign policy priorities, and I think a large part of its foreign policy priorities today is centered around how do you manage migration from Africa. So I think there is a certain sense in which Italy wanted to put that issue on the table. Canada may not have those priorities, and I think for Canada at this point, perhaps the biggest challenge would be Mr. Trump himself, having him on board and trying to get him somehow to be involved in the process. So I think Mr. Carney can be excused for not thinking about some parts of the world that are very, very critical. But I think this is a larger issue in some ways, that whether our institutions, platforms that we have created over the last few decades are fit for purpose. If you think of these platforms as reflective of certain kinds of 20th century realities, then they certainly need to be more appealing, fitter for purpose, more suited to our times. And in that sense, we are moving into a phase where many of these platforms are becoming are on the verge of becoming redundant. And as we have been discussing, G7 also is facing a moment of reckoning. If you have the biggest and the most powerful country in the world that used to be the leader of such platforms no longer interested, then it becomes very difficult for other 6 of the members to corral around an idea, to bring together countries, to bring together other nations, and take and move with a certain sense of purpose. And I think that's what we are witnessing in G7 as well. Whatever Mr. Carney might say, Canada is not is not organically seen as a leader of the G7. Now they are hosting it, but it doesn't mean that they have the wherewithal to bring together countries across Europe, across transatlantic geography, and make a case to the world that, look, we are willing to now lead on issues of global governance. And that is what I think we are facing. The reason why G20 brought in African Union and India played an important role in ensuring that happens was because G20 was also facing the similar issue about its own relevance, about the fact that what is the direction it wants to take, whether countries are interested in what G20 is doing at all. So I think by including a large geography like Africa into subsuming that within the G20, it allowed for a more organically more fruitful conversations to happen. And I think that is where it seems to me that G7 eventually will also go, because this idea of inviting non-members, outreach members to the summits has been now going on for a while, and it is going on for a while because of this recognition that G7 in and of itself do not have any greater degree of credibility for global governance, for providing solutions to global problems, and therefore we need to bring in countries from other geographies, and this is what was reflected. But I think more fundamentally today G7 is facing a problem not with regard to outreach countries itself, but with regard to the very inception of its idea, where America is not interested, where Trump is not interested. And I don't know what happens over the next 4 years, whether you have these pro forma summits going on for the next another 3 years, where America is just not invested, because that would also mean that the credibility gets further undercut. So it's a very challenging time, I think, for G7, for transatlantic unity, for the unity among the developed world. And I think that's what is getting also reflected in the way they are not able to come to any kind of a solid agenda on global governance, as was reflected perhaps in the joint statement itself, which is, in the absence of a joint statement, or the joint statement that was relatively varied in its aspiration, but not very exact given the demanding times that we face. And I think that's the challenge for G7, but that's also a challenge for the larger institutional frameworks that we have available from the 20th century, and now we are trying to make them fit for the 21st century, which is also evolving very, very rapidly.
Indeed. Ambassador Mukul, just to build on the argument made there by Professor Pant and you as well earlier on in your intervention, are we looking, given the fact that the US is indifferent to global affairs, is US in some ways is on the retreat, are we looking at a fragmented multipolarity, and how would that play itself out in the near term?
No, absolutely. I think that's a given. I mean, it's a fact of life. It's a reality that today the world has moved away from the bipolarity of the Cold War, followed by a unipolar moment for a short while, where America was in the lead, and now we have a very multipolar world. And the difficulty is that some of the developed countries are not able to come to terms with that reality. The point is that the sooner they accept that, the better for everybody, including themselves and their organizations like the G7. Now, I mean, the fact that the G7 will not have a communique, but it will have issue-related outcomes. I mean, that itself is an acknowledgement that there is great divergence, and they are not able to come to terms, despite the fact that I must say that Prime Minister Carney has tried to keep the agenda away from the most controversial issues. In fact, he had put in protecting the communities, which really meant peace and security. Obviously, the G7 is supposed to, since 1975, came into being with the objective, with the stated objective of addressing existential crisis. And if what is happening today in the world, the three wars, if I can put it like that, going on, if they are not existential crisis, then what is? So yes, I think the G7 really needs to do a lot of introspection and really needs to get its act together.
Professor Pant, how should one read how India is invited every time as an outreach invitee to the G7 summit? This is the 6th consecutive time that Prime Minister will be addressing it. Does it go on to show that the Western world recognizes India as the voice of Global South, as someone which has a lot of heft diplomatically, strategically, economically, geopolitically?
Yeah, I think, India is very difficult to ignore in some ways because partly India's economic heft is very visible. If we are the fastest growing major economy, if we are the fourth and third largest, soon to be third largest major economy in the world, then I think that it becomes almost impossible to ignore India's claims and India's position, which also means that a lot of the solutions that perhaps the West is trying to find would require partners like India. Whether it is climate, whether it is technology regulation, whether it is the idea that international security is in doldrums, whether it is global governance of governance frameworks of multilateral institutions. I think there is a voice of India which is quite distinct. There is a voice of India that also bridges that divide that we have been talking about. And India is one of the few countries which can talk to multiple stakeholders. If you think of how effective India was in bridging the North-South divide during its G20 presidency. Very few countries would have been able to do that. You also have to think in today's context. I think your reporter earlier was talking about how India is perhaps one of the few countries that still has channels of communication open in the Middle East, in West Asia. Our foreign policy has dealt with or continues to deal with significant equities in the Arab world, with Iran, with Israel. And I think that's very few countries have that ability and agility. And which also means that in some ways, India becomes an important interlocutor. Now, I think at a time when America is saying that Russia should be invited to G7, it is quite extraordinary that India, for example, had always maintained that without the two sides coming to terms, that they need to talk to each other, you will not find a long-term solution to the problem in Ukraine. So I do think that India's voice carries weight because India, in some ways, exemplifies a responsible global stakeholder at a time when there is a leadership void, at a time when global order is breaking down. There are very few countries, perhaps, that can be looked at in that manner, and therefore India's presence at the G7 becomes not only necessary, but also in some ways for G7 or for the Western countries, for the developed world, it becomes a strategic imperative that a country like India should be engaged with, given not only India's ability to bridge, but also India's economic and strategic heft. So I do think that this trend is likely to continue. We knew, for example, there was a lot of speculation in India initially that perhaps Prime Minister Modi would not be invited this time, given India's relations with Canada and what was happening in the last few years. But I think for Canada, for Mark Carney to make this beginning is eminently sensible. And I think if, again, this can lay the foundations of a new relationship between India and Canada going forward, this would also be a big achievement of a G7, which perhaps in other areas may not be able to achieve much. But I do think that India, not only this summit, but it will have to become a regular feature going forward as well, because if you don't have India at the table, then I think a lot of the conversations that perhaps the world wants to have, world leaders want to have amongst themselves, become almost meaningless. So I do think that it is a sign of both of India's growing heft, but also recognition of that heft in providing solutions to global problems.
Indeed. Ambassador Mukul, just as we wait for the first visuals of the Prime Minister's arrival at the summit venue and the family photograph, if I may just quickly ask you, if you were to spare a moment to talk about what happens on the margins of a summit can sometimes be as important as the summit itself. In that context, we're looking forward to a number of bilaterals with the Prime Minister, including with the leaders of Germany, Italy, including Canada, the host country. Talking about India-Canada ties, Ambassador Mukul, do you think this could be the beginning of a reset in India-Canada ties?
No, absolutely. I think while multilateral events are important in themselves, it is equally important the opportunity that they provide for bilaterals on the sidelines, be they formal or structured bilaterals, be they informal meetings, or sometimes just pull-asides. So, I mean, given the constraint on time and calendars of various leaders, because they are obviously extremely busy during the summit schedule. But yes, I think from our perspective, perhaps apart from the fact that Prime Minister's statement at the outreach is important, and when India speaks, the world listens. So I think that will be one important achievement for us, setting out our perspectives on counterterrorism, and as I had outlined, on technology, on energy, on global South development, etc. issues. But in addition to that, I think this provides a great opportunity, and in terms of the bilaterals that the Prime Minister will be having, not least of which will be with the host Mark Carney of Canada, particularly given the recent difficulties that the two countries have had in their bilateral relations. So I think if that could turn out to be that meeting could lead to some kind of a breakthrough, I think that would in itself be a great achievement in terms of restoring our relationship, because there is a lot of potentiality with regard to trade, investment on the economic side, but also in terms of the people-to-people contact, given that a large number, we have a huge diaspora in Canada. Also the fact that education is a very major area of growth and future cooperation. India has now allowed foreign universities to set up campuses. Other countries are doing so. Maybe some Canadian universities would get interested. And then there are, of course, a very large number of Indian students studying in Canada. So yes, the opportunities with regard to Canada are really huge. And I think we would be definitely looking forward to seeing the bilateral meeting point in that direction. Also, the fact that we are working without high commissioners in each of our countries and reduce diplomatic personnel in the high commissions, both in Delhi and in Ottawa. I think if that could be also, this meeting could lead to a trajectory where that could also be restored in the coming days, weeks or months, then I think that would certainly be a big positive. So yes, the bilateral meeting with the host, Mark Carney, and in addition to that, the other bilaterals. I mean, again, these are opportunities because it's not possible for leaders to have standalone bilateral visits, however much they may try, given their domestic, etc., compulsions. So these summits provide a great opportunity for leaders, and as you said, perhaps there are meetings with other leaders who are present, like Germany, Italy, etc. And I think that's always,
and Ukraine as well, Ambassador Mukul. Just for the benefit of our viewers, bilaterals with the leaders of Germany, Italy, Ukraine, and Canada are
scheduled,
finalized as of now.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's fine. I mean, considering that there are 4 bilaterals, I think the Prime Minister is there for barely 24 hours. And in addition to his summit-related commitments and requirements, we already have 4 confirmed bilaterals. So I think that would again be very useful because, as I said, it's not possible to have standalone bilateral visits as frequently as perhaps they would be desired. So yes, these summits provide a great opportunity, and I think these are all our strategic partners. Also, with regard to Europe, it is important that Germany and Italy Prime Minister is part of this trip, has already been to Cyprus, and he will be rounding it up with a visit to Croatia. So I think the India-Europe relations also are moving quite rapidly, and we look forward to having a free trade agreement or the BTIA between India and EU before the end of this year. So that augurs well, and of course the meeting with the President of Ukraine, I think the Prime Minister has already been in touch with both sides, President Putin directly here, and also with the Ukrainian President. And I think his message would be the same, that we need to look at ways to de-escalate and have an end to this war that has been going on now for a bit too long.
Yes, we'll take the conversation on the bilaterals forward, but before that, let's go across to our correspondent Akshay Dongre, who continues to be with us in the newsroom. Akshay, we remember still what the Prime Minister had said in his outreach summit statement at Apulia last time around in June last year, where he spoke of the positive impacts of AI, how it can aid development and how it should aid development. He also spoke about the negative effects of AI, to name a few. This time around, what are the issues that he is expected to touch as per the MEA and your understanding?
Well, Munmun, one of the most important issues, and strategically for India, presence of Prime Minister Narendra Modi at G7 summit is crucial also, because this is the first multinational and multilateral forum where Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going after Operation Sindoor. And this is going to be quite important as far as India's direct message to the world is concerned about terrorism. That how it continues to plague the world, how it continues to destabilize the world, and the countries that are sponsoring or supporting terrorism and terrorists in any manner are also contributing to the destabilization of the entire world, as a larger collateral damage of terrorism breeding in one part of the world and then spreading out and creating chaos across the globe. So terrorism is definitely going to be on the top of the agenda, especially the Pakistan-sponsored terrorism that is impacting the entire region, be it Afghanistan, India, other countries around the world are finding some kind of link with Pakistan when it comes to terrorism. So that is going to be on the top of the agenda. We have sent out teams, delegations to give India's message to the world. But what better place than the G7 summit, where some of the largest economies will be gathering at one place and listening directly from the Prime Minister of the country that what exactly transpired. So this is a wonderful opportunity that we see as far as India's outreach is concerned, giving out a message to the world is concerned against cross-border terrorism and terror infrastructure as well as terror funding, because it's ultimately an economic forum, and how funding impacts and enhances terrorism in many forms is certainly going to be picked up by India's Prime Minister President Narendra Modi when he speaks to the leaders there. But besides that particular issue, there are other issues that are impacting the world and the global south in general, that include climate change and how it is impacting not only the farming communities, agriculture industries of these countries, especially the countries that do not have the resources to safeguard their people as well as their crops and other kind of produces that they have. So that is one thing as far as crucial issues are concerned. Climate change is going to be there. Advanced manufacturing is taking headlines, is making headlines rather across the world. So advanced manufacturing, quantum computing, semiconductors, and how countries like India can be an ideal place away from all of this chaos, a stable democracy, and a rule-based country where these investments can flow. So that is going to be one of the major issues. Trade is also going to be quite crucial with an FTA with the UK and FTA on the lines with the European countries as well. So that is going to be crucial as well. So there are several aspects to what Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be taking up, and the kind of crucial issues that he will be taking up as far as the region and Indian interests are concerned. But also these conflicts that are going on will be taking a center stage amid all of this chaos that's taking place in the West Asian region, and how countries can in fact come to diplomatic channels and dialogue tables to avoid any kind of lives being hampered or lives getting lost in all of this mindless violence. So all of these are going to be some of the most important issues where Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be speaking, and in fact the world will be listening, because India has now one of the most important stakes when it comes to not only the global economy but also other issues that impact the world.
Indeed, Akshay, as we wait for the first visuals to emerge of the Prime Minister's arrival at the summit venue, I want to go back to the PM's departure statement, where he spoke about the G7 summit in particular. He said the summit will provide space for exchange of views on pressing global issues and the priorities of the global south. I also look forward to engaging with leaders from partner countries. Interestingly, the session he will speak on is titled Energy Security, Diversification, Technology and Infrastructure to ensure access and affordability in a changing world. Now, when PM Modi speaks, he would be speaking not only on behalf of India, but also on behalf of the global south. So in that context, since you refer to climate change, what are the key issues that he might flag in his intervention there?
If we are talking about this particular session where Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be addressing the other countries and of his contemporaries, counterparts, as far as Prime Minister's pitch for Global South is concerned, climate certainly is one of the issues that is impacting these countries. These conflicts and all of these issue of terrorism not only impacting the South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, or even the African continent, but it's impacting the rest of the world as well. So when it comes to the Global South countries, they do not or may not have adequate infrastructure or resources in place to avoid any kind of any of these activities. There are several countries that are getting blackmailed by countries that sponsor terrorism, by threatening them with terrorist incidents indirectly. So all of these issues, the issue of terrorism remains one of the very important issues. Digital economy, digitization of the developing world, the developing countries, that is going to be a crucial point that will be taken up by the Prime Minister, especially given India's experience in these fields. So any kind of opportunities where India can share its own expertise with its global south nations, India will be sharing it. India will be sharing its own experiences and challenges, be it when it comes to climate change, when it comes to agriculture industry, when it comes to setting up a manufacturing base for economy, or rather march on towards a high growth rate of your economy. So all of these issues will be talked about by the Prime Minister, and clearly when it comes to the member nations of the G7 and the global south countries, everyone will be very keenly listening to what Prime Minister has to say, has to offer, and whatever he has to discuss with these countries, and what are the things that India is bringing to the table, being the fourth largest economy of the world. So all of these are going to be very pertinent points that will be taken up by the Prime Minister when he speaks at the G7 summit.
Right. Also joining us at this point in time in this special broadcast is Professor Umu Salpa Bawa with the Center for European Studies at JNU. Professor, welcome to DD India. We were earlier talking also about the bilaterals of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's schedule there. We know that one of the confirmed bilaterals is with the Canadian Prime Minister, and we've already spoken here about how this could be an opportunity to reset ties. That was also the indication coming from the MEA. But Professor, do you also think that Carney's invitation to Prime Minister Modi should be seen as an attempt at dehyphenation between domestic politics and international diplomacy? Today, one of the leading newspapers reported about how there are efforts that are on, negotiations are going on between India and Canada to have a joint working group that deals with transnational crimes, and so that Indian concerns with regard to secessionist activities there can be taken up, and some judicial processes that Canada is said to be concerned about can also be taken up there, and international diplomacy and regional diplomacy and other issues are not affected by that. How do you look at this bit?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the panel tonight. I think, one, as you correctly said, point out that bilateral relations, have to be defined between larger concentric circles about events happening bilaterally between states, but also in terms of what else is happening. I think, 10 years down the road after India and Canada elevated their relationship 10 years back to a strategic partnership, there were developments last year which one would not have anticipated in the bilateral. But that shows that the fact that India has been invited, Prime Minister Modi is there, continuously now for the 6th and 7th time attending the G7 summit, is also indicative of where India is today, not only in this global economic hierarchy, but also how India has become important to global developments and conversations. And so definitely, when challenges take place at the bilateral level, it is also important to see that states will find a way forward. You cannot be stuck in time with what has happened at a particular point. And I think one has to see these developments in these contexts. The Canadian Prime Minister himself has said that given India's growing stature, there's no way that India can be ignored. So I think that itself is indicative and can be read in multiple ways. As a political statement which says that India needs to be there on these various global fora. It is an important partner, not only at bilateral, but at these multilateral meetings. Second, how do you move forward after developments which saw a kind of turn which one doesn't expect when you especially think that a bilateral relationship has been taken up to the level of a strategic partnership. So one would expect that, irritants which come up will not derail a relationship. So anyways, they happened. And I think what you see at this point forward is also a step forward in the sense there's an invitation by Canada. Of course, it's heading a G7. But on the sidelines of the G7, as it is known to happen very often, a lot of bilateral meetings take place. And so this could be seen as also an important testing water for taking forward the bilateral relationship in terms of at least resetting the clock. And as you said, to, probably de-hyphenate the domestic and the international. But India and Canada share, various kinds of political, economic relations. And the totality of that, means that mature leadership will find ways forward to take forward the bilateral relationship. And I think that's what we should see that as a very welcome sign, that along with India being part of this multilateral initiative, which is the G7 and what it stands for, turning 50 at this point in time, the moment also on the sidelines to reset the India-Canada relations.
Indeed. Ambassador Mukul, we began this broadcast by discussing about Trump and how he left the venue in a hurry. We don't know yet as to why he chose to do that, but various speculation is going around that probably he wants to get back to finding out what can be done to resolve the Iran-Israel hostilities. In that context, in the hour since he has left Canada, he has been furiously posting messages on his social media account, including referring to how the US now has complete control over the skies over Iran. He's also posted another message saying that we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. A number of similar messages. So in that context, going back to the elephant in the room, the Iran-Israel hostilities, Ambassador Mukul, one, is regime change probable in Iran? Number one. Number two, what would be India's position, generally speaking, on the Iran-Israel hostilities?
No, I think first one should understand that as the saying goes, when war begins, diplomacy ceases. I mean, you cannot have negotiations with the guns firing around. So yes, if there has to be a deal, which I think Mr. Trump keeps reiterating, even if it is seen as a deal under threat, but the point is that first the hostilities should cease. The statement that you have you have quoted just now is a clear threat, and I think it doesn't augur well in terms of, I mean, you cannot force a country to sign a treaty. In fact, if you go back with regard to this issue of Trump vis-a-vis Iran, in fact, there was an excellent deal, the JCPOA, what is called the joint agreement that was there in force till 2017, when in his first term, he kind of, annulled it, because that was an agreement that had all the elements of limiting, monitoring, and supervising the nuclear program of Iran, and therefore it was negotiated by the leading countries with Iran. It was accepted by the international community, and in fact, Trump appended it by abrogating it. Now, what we are seeing today is a result of that. Now that we have seen threats, basically saying we know where the leader is hiding, etc. I don't see this as leading anywhere, because Iran is ultimately a civilizational power. I mean, it's not any small country. And with regard to your question about regime change, my sense is, well, whatever may happen in the medium to longer term, in the immediate term, the first sentiment during such times is that the nationalist sentiment prevails, and there is in fact even those who do not really like the regime tend to support the government of the day, considering that there is a national crisis. So I don't think this is very, very productive or constructive in terms of getting a lasting solution. In any case, a agreement which is forced at the gunpoint does not have any credibility. And we know the record of the United States when in 2003 they cited weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and went into and destroyed that country. And then later on, it turned out there was nothing. It was completely a red herring. So this business of whether Iran is developing nuclear weapons and how far or how near it is to having nuclear weapons. I mean, these are all elements in the nature of speculation. I think what has been done is really against the sovereign country has been attacked, and I think this doesn't augur well at all for peace in West Asia, and I only hope it doesn't escalate into something wider. With regard to India's position, I think we have always been very clear. I think Prime Minister has in this context also reiterated his advice that this is not an era of war. He has said that it's best that these countries come back to diplomacy and dialogue. But as I said, that can only happen once the actual shooting, which is going on, stops. You cannot have diplomacy or negotiations going on when there is a shooting war or a bombardment going on. As we saw, because there were negotiations scheduled last Sunday, a couple of days back, in Oman, between the United States and Iran, which had to be called off because the war had broken out. By then, the Israeli attack or bombing had started. So I think this is something which is very unfortunate, and it is against, in my opinion, against all norms of international behavior, because you are attacking or you have started operations against a sovereign country without any proof, if I can put it that way.
Okay, we'll take that point forward. The question remains whether Donald Trump will continue to dominate the agenda of G7 even in his absence, because of the kind of statements that are being put out by him on his social media handles with regard to the Israel-Iran war. And will this war really dominate the agenda? It's been dominating, but will it totally overshadow the agenda is the question that still remains. On to some more updates that are coming in from the G7 summit in Canada. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hailed an intensive and good G7, saying the European Union is in intense and demanding negotiations for a trade agreement with the United States.
We had a good G7. I mean, planned were 5 sessions. We've done 4 yesterday in the presence of President Trump. There are 6 statements, 1 Middle East statement on top, and the chair statement. The added value of G7 is always to have frank and open discussion. All this has happened. So this was an intensive, good G7, I think.
Right, let's get to some other updates as well of leaders at the ongoing G7 summit in Canada, meeting for a working breakfast session to focus on the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Earlier in the morning, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said Ottawa would provide $1.47 billion in new military assistance for Kyiv, as well as impose new financial sanctions on Russia. When the summit ends later on Tuesday, Carney plans to issue a statement on the escalating tensions in West Asia.
And Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney also hosted world leaders, including Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, during a roundtable at the G7 summit.
Professor Bava, coming to you now on the China factor, because some commentators are of the view that China would not be happy by the kind of importance that India commands at the global stage, including at the G7, where even Mr. Carney had enumerated reasons why India is an important presence at the G7 every time, and that all the G7 members were on board on the idea of inviting India. But the commentators are of the view that there are 2 concerns that seem to have gripped China's strategic community. One, will G7 jointly deal with China's rare earth control? And the other, of course, being that should India be given the opportunity to become the bridge between the West and the South? So here is China, that was invited numerous times between 1999 and 2006 to be part of the G7 platform, but it was always suspicious of it. Despite G7 inviting China in those years, China repeatedly refused. It said that it would have to accept and abide by the rules set by the West and assume the international responsibilities assigned by them. So it chose not to go. So here there is a country that chooses not to go when invited to a G7 summit, but questions the presence of another country that is invited and chooses to go and represents the voice of the global South.
Right. So, I mean, you can look at it and put it this way, two very different kind of Asian countries responding to the G7 grouping. And I think one has to put it in a larger political perspective. India has, looked at the G7 not as something to be suspicious about. It has a historical antecedent coming through in the 1970s, rather 1975, in the backdrop of the oil crisis. And it continues to that extent to be still a very Western kind of a grouping, which over a period of time has expanded to introduce and bring in guests or select group of countries depending upon whoever is holding the chair. So the prerogative to invite is the prerogative of the country holding the chair, and that's important to emphasize, which also means that at different points in time, one could look at the group of countries invited as indicative of what are matters and issues currently on the agenda of the G7. China refusing to partake of the invitation, I think, speaks more about their own preoccupations by looking at the groupings and how they have sought to give it their own interpretation in terms of a political validity. So I think it's important to make a distinction in that India has had, and continues to have very good relations with all the G7 countries. So it was, in that sense, also reflective, and the fact that Prime Minister has been attending the G7 summit for the last 7 years consecutively is reflective of a much larger issue, and that is about the position, role, and the growth of India, which means that at this point it's going to be very difficult to think that India would not be part of any of these lists when global discussions are going to take place. As the fourth largest economy, it means it is part of the global economic engine. Whether any country likes it or not, I think that is a fact, and every country will have to work with that. So it's a tremendous opportunity. I think it also is reflective about how leadership in each of these countries, look at what are the developments and how does the leadership, engage with the political invitation of this kind. I think there's meaning to it. Of course, to say that, all the G7 countries are the world leading countries, they were at a point in time, and definitely the economic, pyramid looks very different today in 2025. But as they say, there is value in different kinds of interaction. And for India to be part of that discussion, is a clear acknowledgement of where India is and what India brings, I think, more importantly, both in terms of the political dialogue. You spoke about India being the bridge. Prime Minister has very clearly stated, and it goes back to our own, G20 summit, where we said and spoke about the world as one large family. So I think in a period where crisis is, overriding any kind of cooperation, how do different voices add value to global connections and conversations has become extremely important then. And so the slogan of Vasudev Kutumbakam that Prime Minister constantly keeps talking about means we are only on this one planet. And if there is a war and a crisis happening, it's going to impact everybody. So I think you clearly see a very different kind of voice of sanity that Prime Minister Modi brings when he is entering into these conversations.
Right. Ambassador Mukul, since we are standing by for the first visuals to emerge from the summit of a family photograph of all leaders attending the summit in Kananaskis, let me quickly ask you, yesterday on day one, we saw an interesting visual emerging of Keir Starmer holding a media availability with Trump. Now there, Starmer says that the global affairs management is incomplete without the US leadership. At the same time, we saw the UK, for instance, lead, impose sanctions on Israeli ministers. In particular, we saw other European countries, including Ireland, remaining hostile to Israel. In a sense, is European unity coming in the way of Trump's ideas on, say, Russia-Ukraine conflict or the Israel issue? Because we've seen that the Europeans are dead against a possible rapprochement with the Kremlin. At the same time, on Israel, for instance, there's a dissonance between Europe and the US. So is European unity still intact and coming in the way of Trump's ideas in resolving some of these crises?
No, I think I would not call it European unity. I would call it a transatlantic dissonance that we see here. Europe is by and large, I think, on the same page. Of course, there will be some differences among themselves, but really it is the transatlantic dissonance or dichotomy that is creating problems, as I had pointed out, and that is where I think the G7 faces its existential challenge in terms of getting its act together, whether, as you said, it is on the Iran-Israel issue, whether it is on the Ukraine-Russia issue, or on so many other issues. In fact, that was the reason where Prime Minister Ghani, as the host, tried to avoid some of the controversial issues which he could see, so that, typically G7 addresses a lot of other issues also, like development, Africa, aid, climate change. Now, these are not among the priorities which Prime Minister Ghani has put forward for his presidency and for this summit. Basically knowing that there would be a lot of disagreement. Of course, he could not avoid the Israel-Iran problem, because that has kind of come in the last few days and it has overshadowed this summit. But the fact is that the agenda, the three main agenda items which Canada had put forward, were those that he thought he would be able to pull through. One being the protection of the communities of the world, which actually also has, if you break it down, in terms of it is peace and security, it is transnational crime, it is migration, and it is wildfires. In fact, for Canada, wildfire is also a very major issue. Last year and this year, they have had major issues. So that was the first priority that he had put forward. The second priority of his of this summit was energy security and digital transition, which can also be broken down into the critical mineral supply chain, etc. And since we were discussing China, I think it is important to point out that just last month, the G7 finance ministers issued a communique just before the summit, which had pointed out to continued monitoring of the of the non-market economies, a clear reference or euphemism for China's subsidies and China's currency, etc. manipulation. While China was obviously not named, it was clear what they were talking about when they talked of monitoring, continued monitoring of non-market economies. So that was something they thought that they could all be on the same page. Similarly, artificial intelligence and quantum technology leading to economic growth. Now, as Munmun was pointing out, our Prime Minister also at the Italy summit had talked of not just the negative and positive, but also the fact that there should be inclusiveness with regard to use of artificial intelligence, and it should not be monopolized by a few. He had also spoken at that time about the partnership, the global partnership on AI. Similarly, the third priority put forward by Mark Carney for this summit was what he called partnerships for the future. On this, he is referring to attracting private investment for open markets, private investment infrastructure and for getting a higher paid jobs. So those are his domestic, more also catered to his domestic requirements of the Canadian economy. So these were some of the priorities which he had outlined. Of course, the events of the as they have unfolded in the last few days have completely overshadowed, and many of these things we have not heard. But I think our Prime Minister will definitely bring some of these items back into focus when he speaks at the summit, particularly with regard to technology and AI, with regard to energy, which is also something he had spoken about in Italy, having talked of India being the only major economy which was meeting its COP targets. Yeah. He had spoken about net zero by 2070, and of course the famous thing about plant for mother, ek ped maa ke naam, etc. So some of these energy issues, energy transition issues will also, I think, be brought. And finally, I think the Prime Minister will also focus, as we have been discussing, on the global South issues, which has been completely avoided by the Canadians, given the sensitivity of particularly Mr. Trump with regard to who has disbanded the US aid with regard to development issues and climate issues. So that is where I think I would summarize in terms of the priorities which the Canadian Prime Minister has outlined and how they have unfolded so far.
Right. Professor Bawa, earlier we were talking about how this is an opportunity for India and Canada to reset the bilateral relationship. But do you also see a reset in the Canada-United States relationship under Mark Carney, considering how things had gone downhill under Justin Trudeau, when Justin Trudeau was the Prime Minister? That was the case with India. That was also the case with the United States. During the Quebec G7 summit that Canada had hosted in 2018, Donald Trump had walked out, and we know that he had asked his officials to withdraw consensus from the communique as well, and this time only chair summary is coming up. And then we also heard Mr. Carney say that G7 is rudderless without the US, and we also saw Donald Trump wearing pins with flags of both the United States and Canada, in a sense showing solidarity with Canada. Do you think that Mark Carney is playing his cards well?
I think as, the Prime Minister of Canada, it would be his first priority to, reset and restore relations with the most important country at your border. Let's not forget the volumes of trade, the people-to-people contact, the political implications of any of these issues have been discussed endlessly. So I think in terms of the fact that here is a new elected, Prime Minister, his number one priority would be to restore and bring that relationship back as much as possible. It takes two to tango, and so obviously, Canada cannot do it alone unless the US comes on board. So between, what have been the statements coming out of America since early January to today, multiple developments have taken place, not only within America, but also in Canada. And every opportunity by any, able leader would be to seize the moment to see that they can move the needle forward in improving and strengthening bilateral relations. So I think, given that Trump has already exited the G7 summit, whatever understanding and building, or what I would call as a political rapprochement, to be taking place between Canada and the US would have transpired yesterday itself. The global attention, even as we speak, seems to have moved away from Canada to what is happening between, Israel and Iran. So I think in those sidelines, in those photo op moments, definitely a big crucial step. And it's also interesting to think that, there was an earlier G7 summit which took place in Canada, which saw so much of standoff with Trump attending at this time, again leaving early. And of course, the settings for those where he exited are very different. But I think at this point, there will be an attempt and probably given the backdrop of the crisis which is happening in the Middle East, some of the heat at the US, Canada bilateral relations seems to have dissipated in terms of political speculation and attention to how much the escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran can be kind of contained, localized, and does not go beyond where it is at this point in time. But definitely, I think the first steps in the fact of that bilateral resetting definitely has taken place in terms of both the leaders meeting.
Indeed, and while we wait for the latest visuals from the venue of the summit in Canada, if I can go back to our guest, Ambassador Mukul, one more time on this broadcast, hopefully we'll get some more visuals by then. Ambassador Mukul, if you were to take a step back and look at the overriding logic of the PM's ongoing visit to three countries, namely Cyprus, Canada and Croatia, covering the continents of Europe and North America, would you say that the salience of EU or Europe in general in India's foreign policy calculations have gone up, primarily because, as you mentioned, referred to a short while ago, the transatlantic rift or dissonance?
No, I think it's not just because of the transatlantic thing. India's relations with Europe stand on their own merit, and I think Europe has always been very important to us and will remain so. So I don't really link it to the transatlantic dissonance directly, but coming back to the question, the specific point that you raised, I think the two countries chosen, Cyprus and Croatia, are important. Croatia, of course, as we know, was scheduled during his last visit to Europe, which he had to cut short because of what we know happenings here, etc. So that is being restored, and it is the first time an Indian Prime Minister will be visiting Croatia tomorrow. For the first time ever, an Indian Prime Minister will be there. With regard to Cyprus, it is an important country in many ways. It is a member of the EU, though it's kind of in Asia. It is also a Mediterranean country and a member of Commonwealth. As we saw, a very substantive joint communique came out of the meeting between our Prime Minister and the President of Cyprus yesterday, which had spelt out and is trying to make our partnership comprehensive, a large number of issues, including our own initiative of the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which has salience. There is reference to shipping because it's a Mediterranean power. There is reference to energy and gas there. So yes, Cyprus by itself, but also Cyprus is going to take over the presidency of the EU, and in that sense there is an added importance to the timing of the visit of Prime Minister to Cyprus. So for all these reasons, both bilateral as also the larger context of India-Europe relations, I think it is important that the Prime Minister's visit is taking place to these countries at this time. You should also remember that earlier this year, the entire European Commission, as it were, under the president of the European Commission, and all the commissioners were in India, and I think we have a hope and a target of sorts that we will have a bilateral trade and investment agreement between India and Europe by the end of the year. So I think there is a very substantial relationship between India and Europe on its own merits, and that I think is something that is on both sides, both Europe, on the side of Europe as well as on our side. I think that needs to be constantly nurtured, and I see the Prime Minister's visit to Cyprus and Croatia in that context.
Right, we'll take a breather at this point in time. Viewers, today is day 3, the final day of the G7 summit in Kananaskis, a resort area in Alberta province of Canada, and the G7 leaders have arrived there. We are waiting for the family photograph with the outreach leaders. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been invited for the 6th consecutive time by the G7 presidency. This time, as you know, Canada is the G7 chair, and Canada has a new Prime Minister in Mark Carney. We'll bring you up to speed with all the developments as they pan out. For now, we'll take a breather. We'll be back with lots more. Stay tuned.